Wednesday morning. It's June 30th, 2021. I'm Guy Mcpherson of Nature Bats Last. You can find Nature Bats Last at guymcpherson.com. Today I'm going to talk about the big news that broke last Wednesday, in fact. And the news by headline from The Guardian reads, IPCC steps up warning on climate tipping points in leaked draft report. The reference here is to a 4,000-page report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, due out, well, it depends on what you read when the report is due out. So we'll get into some of the details. I'm going to list a few papers here. Links to all of them can be found at guymcpherson.com. Here's the lead from the IPCC paper. Well, first, the subhead, scientists increasingly concerned about thresholds beyond which recovery may become impossible. Apparently, these scientists haven't noticed that we're already past dozens of those thresholds. Here's the lead. Climate scientists are increasingly concerned that global heating will trigger tipping points in Earth's natural systems, which will lead to widespread and possibly irrevocable disaster unless action is taken urgently. To which I would only add, and also if action is taken urgently. There's no way out of this trap. We are past the point of no return by dozens of self-reinforcing feedback loops. The Guardian article continues on, most of the report will not be published in time for consideration by policymakers at COP26, the UN climate talks taking place in November in Glasgow. Tipping points are triggered, the paper says, when temperatures reach a certain level, whereby one impact rapidly leads to a series of cascading events with vast repercussions. For instance, as rising temperatures lead to the melting of Arctic permafrost, the unfreezing soil releases methane, a powerful greenhouse gas that in turn causes more heating. It's almost as if they recognize that's going on right now, because it is, based on abundant peer-reviewed literature. The story goes on, and it's really a story. Other tipping points include the melting of polar ice sheets, which once underway may be almost impossible to reverse, even if carbon emissions are rapidly reduced, and which would raise sea levels catastrophically over many decades, and the possibility of the Amazon rainforest switching suddenly to savanna, which scientists have said could come quickly with relatively small temperature rises. In fact, scientists have been saying this for years and have indicated that the tipping point has been passed already. The Amazon is done, as I've reported in this space many times. The story goes on, again from The Guardian. Bob Ward, the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, because why would you not turn to an economist for information about climate change? That's apparently what we do. He said, quote, scientists have identified several potential regional and global thresholds or tipping points in the climate beyond which impacts become unstoppable or irreversible or accelerate. And to which I would add all of the above, that could create huge social and economic responses, such as population displacements and conflict, and so represent the largest potential risks of climate change. Tipping points should be the climate change impacts about which policymakers worry the most, but they are often left out of assessments by scientists and economists because they are difficult to quantify. They're not that difficult to quantify. We've been quantifying them for decades, and it's obvious that we have passed many of these tipping points rooted strictly in the peer-reviewed literature. What is it going to take? The Amazon is done. The melting of the Arctic sea ice is done. Will happen within a couple of years, maybe 3. On it goes. Previous work by the IPCC has been criticized for failing to take account of tipping points. Yeah. The new report is set to contain the body's strongest warnings yet on the subject. I've no doubt it'll be the strongest warnings yet on the notion of tipping points or self-reinforcing feedback loops. I've also no doubt that it will not go nearly far enough, that it will not acknowledge the evidence already presented in the peer-reviewed literature. Simon Lewis, a professor of global change science at University College London, said, quote, nothing in the IPCC report should be a surprise, as all the information comes from the scientific literature. There you go. an outright admission that the scientific literature, the peer-reviewed evidence, has been pointing out that we have passed the point of no return long ago, that there will be no surprises in this 4,000-page report. No, there won't, except the admission that we're in trouble. Simon Lewis added, quote, "The exact timing of tipping points and the links between them is not well understood by scientists, so they have been underreported in past IPCC assessments," we all say. The blunter language from the IPCC this time is welcome, as people need to know what is at stake if society does not take action to immediately slash carbon emissions, end quote. And I would say, if society also does take rapid action to reduce carbon emissions, which would reduce the aerosol masking effect and cause our almost immediate extinction, or at least almost immediate loss of habitat for human animals. Back to the paper. Miles Allen, a professor of geosystem science at the University of Oxford, declined to comment on the draft report, but stressed that avoiding dire impacts was still possible. That's an outright lie. Quote, "It's important people don't get the message we're doomed anyway, so why bother? This is a fixable problem. We could stop global warming in a generation if we wanted to, which would mean limiting future warming to not much more than has happened already this century. We also know how. It's just a matter of getting on with it," end quote. Well, that's just lie after lie after lie. Failure to acknowledge the aerosol masking effect, indicating that we have not triggered self-reinforcing feedback loops, putting the burden on future generations, and failing to point that current generations, the people currently on the planet, have warmed the planet by double in the last 15 years, as I've already pointed out at GuyMcPherson.com. The report says that with 1.1 C of warming above pre-industrial levels clocked so far, wait, what? The IPCC is admitting that we're above 1 C so far? More about that momentarily. From Al Jazeera, also last Wednesday, June 23rd, with the headline, "Leaked UN Draft Report Warns of Accelerating Climate Devastation," and the subhead, "Devastating climate effects from unlivable heat to more widespread disease are accelerating and will become obvious within 30 years. Draft UN report says. Within 30 years? For anybody paying attention, it's obvious already. Will become obvious within 30 years. Apparently they meant to file this story 30 years ago, because it's really obvious now that the train has fallen off the tracks. The document is not scheduled for release until February 2022, according to the story in Al Jazeera. Too late for crunch UN summits this year on climate, biodiversity, and food systems. All right, so February 2022. The IPCC released a statement on Wednesday saying it, quote, "does not comment on the contents of draft reports while work is still ongoing," end quote. So they lie in the reports, and then they lie by not admitting what's in the reports, or even that we have a report. From this story at Al Jazeera comes the subtitle, "Irreversible Consequences." Wait, what? You can't write that in the corporate media. Irreversible consequences? Curious. It is already changing. Yes, it most certainly is. More about that 1.1 admission shortly. For some plants and animals, it could be too late. Yeah, like for most plants and animals, like for all plants and animals, it's already too late. Back to the story in Al Jazeera. For some plants and animals, it could be too late. Quote, "Even at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, conditions will change beyond many organisms' ability to adapt," end quote, the report notes. Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason for that I've pointed out repeatedly at GuyMcPherson.com, and I'm going to turn to that again shortly. Continuing from the paper in Al Jazeera, there is very little good news in the report, but the IPCC stresses that much can be done to avoid worst-case scenarios and prepare for effects that can no longer be averted. No, there's not. No, there's not. Perhaps I need to repeat that. No, there's not. From the paper, Conservation and Restoration of So-Called Blue Carbon Ecosystems, kelp and mangrove forests, for example, enhance carbon stocks and protect against storm surges, as well as providing wildlife habitats, coastal livelihoods, and food security. Also, transitioning to more plant-based diets could also reduce food-related emissions by as much as 70% by 2050. I guarantee your 70% will be a pipe dream by the time we get to 2050, and we're at net zero emissions. All right. Going back to a more recent paper, this one in Axios, published Saturday, June 26th, 2021, entitled The Next Major Climate Science Report, What to Expect. And a few lines from this story in Axios. The new report will be used to help inform policymakers headed to the next round of UN climate talks in November in Glasgow. Notice that the two previous papers, those in Al Jazeera and The Guardian, indicated that the report would not be available until next February, certainly not in time for the November COP26 talks in Glasgow. The 5 key areas to watch in the new report, according to this paper in Axios, are: 1, for the first time, this report will include information, an entire chapter, in fact. So out of 4,000 pages, they dedicate an entire chapter, in fact, on how human-caused global warming is tilting the odds toward more extreme events, such as heat waves and heavy precipitation. Geez, we've only known since the 1970s that a warmer climate is a wetter climate, that as the planet heats up, it puts more water into the atmosphere, and what goes up must come down. And here we are, already reporting that in 2021, some 50 years later. Number 2, the report will place a greater emphasis on regional information that policymakers can use for climate risk assessments, because they can't come right out and say, we're done. So they have to shift the burden of responsibility to regional policymakers. Number 3, it, meaning the report, will look at a wider range of emissions scenarios, including more information about how greenhouse gas emissions are evolving in the real world. Yes, they're skyrocketing. Is that evolving? This could address concerns that too many climate studies use worst-case scenario projections that don't match actual emissions trends. No, they don't. The worst-case scenarios don't even come close to matching the emissions we're putting into the atmosphere. They fall far short. Number 4. The report will have revised figures for how sensitive the climate is to a doubling of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere using a new suite of computer models, some of which have shown a far higher sensitivity than older models. Yes, as newer models have been developed over time, they have been of increasing sensitivity with every single new model that comes out, eclipsing the information presented in previous models and previous papers. And 5, expect a new range of both projected temperature changes and sea level rise through, wait for it, 2100. The 2014 report, for example, did not include scenarios of significant melting that has since been observed in Greenland and parts of Antarctica, which the new report is expected to include. As a great means of distracting the masses, let's focus on things that don't matter, sea level rise being foremost among them. We're going to lose habitat long before sea level rise overwhelms and floods your property. Least of our worries, really. Then, under the subtitle, What They're Saying, according to Zeke Hausfather, Director of Climate and Energy at the Breakthrough Institute and a contributor to the forthcoming report, it is likely to shape our thinking on how close we are to the Paris Agreement's target of limiting global warming to 1.5 C above pre-industrial levels. We didn't make it. We're past 1.5 C, and we have been for years. And this kind of nonsense does nothing except distract people about important topics. Finally, getting to the bottom line, Zcaus are said to expect a focus on when we might cross 1.5 and 2C under different emission scenarios. Done under current emission scenarios, and estimates how sensitive the climate is to increasing amounts of greenhouse gases. All right. There's no mention in any of these three articles that we currently occupy the hottest Earth with Homo sapiens present. Not a single mention. This, according to a 2017 paper by James Hansen and colleagues. I will also include a link to that paper. If you go to guymcpherson.com, you can read it. It's an open access paper. Okay, let's go back in time a little bit further, this time to April 2019, to a paper called Global Trends to 2030, Challenges and Choices for Europe. This paper was published by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System, again, April 2019. And speaking of 1.5 and 2 degrees C, here's a direct quote from this major synthesis. An increase of 1.5 degrees, that's 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. An increase of 1.5 degrees is the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should temperatures increase further beyond 2030, or maybe even by now, we will face even more droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. The likely demise of the most vulnerable populations, and at worst, the extinction of humankind altogether. 1.5 C, the extinction of humankind altogether. We're beyond 1.5 C, above the 1750 baseline. So, there you go. An open admission by this major synthesis from the European Strategy and Policy Analysis Institute, published April 2019, that crossing the 1.5 degrees Celsius point above the 1750 baseline could well lead to extinction of humankind altogether. That's a direct quote. And guess what? We passed that 1.5 C quite a while ago. And yes, I know this is long. It's also important. The book is called Targets and Indicators of Climatic Change. It's edited by somebody whose last name I will have great difficulty pronouncing. Rijberman and Swart, published by the Stockholm Environment Institute in October of 1990. So we're going back a ways here, and the fact that we are going back a ways here does not mean that this evidence is not still valid. What it means is the more recent information failed to point out this very legitimate information reported before by the Stockholm Environment Institute in October of 1990. And I'm going to directly quote just a few spots from this book. 1. A maximum temperature increase of 1.0 degrees C above pre-industrial global mean temperature. That's a target. 1.0 C above the 1750 baseline. These corporate media articles are indicating that the admission is we're at 1.1 C already. What happens beyond 1 C? According to this book, temperature increases beyond 1.0 C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. Yes, they can. Yes, they have. They're ongoing. These are called self-reinforcing feedback loops, what this book calls rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage, and in fact, already have. Also from the report, the target that corresponds to the 1 degree Celsius target indicates a maximum CO2 equivalent concentration of 330 to 400 parts per million. 330 to 400 parts per million CO2 equivalent. Where are we now? Well, we're currently at about 420 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so That alone indicates that we've blown right through the 330 to 400 parts per million equivalent target. In fact, let's just add one more from among more than 40 additional greenhouse gases. Let's just add methane to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere currently about 420. Conservatively, the amount of methane in the atmosphere is 1,800 parts per billion. Now, very conservatively, we'll say that methane is only 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas. So we'll say that's the equivalent of 180 parts per million CO2. That's the methane equivalent, is 180 additional parts per million CO2. So we're at more than 600 parts per million CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere already, counting just two of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There are more than 40 greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So methane is commonly pointed out in journal articles and many times by the IPCC. Methane is relatively short-lived in the atmosphere. But that doesn't matter if it keeps increasing in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter that it decomposes into carbon dioxide and water vapor, both of which are powerful greenhouse gases. That doesn't matter that it breaks down into those two additional greenhouse gases if the abundance of methane in the atmosphere keeps rising. And guess what? It keeps rising. So there you have it. The IPCC is about to come out with its next major synthetic report, and it is filled with nothing but lies and conservatism, failing to acknowledge, much less follow, the precautionary principle, pointing out the lies and the conservatism of the organization, even based on previous papers, previous peer-reviewed papers, and also previous syntheses that they have put out themselves. Am I outraged? Yes. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention.